Hello, welcome to our first Lancaster Environment Centre seminar of 2021. This seminar was by Professor Barbara Maher and it took place as the keynote address at our winter conference, New Thinking, on Friday the 8th of January 2021. This recording therefore includes the comments and questions put to Barbara by our online audience and was chaired by our Research Director, Professor Oliver Wilde. If you'd like to put any questions to Barbara yourself, please send her an email to the address you'll see on the slides and in the description below. We joined the session during Oliver's introduction to our speaker.
On magnetism and nanoparticles and human health, and they've received a lot of both scientific and media interest. And she's topped off the year by becoming the 2020 fellow of the AGU, of the American Geophysical Union, which is quite an accolade. So I say a successful year. So it'll be very interesting to hear what she has to say about her recent research. Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks very much, Oliver. Can everybody A, hear me, and B, see my screen?
I think so.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So thank you very much for this opportunity to kick off the LEC Winter Conference this year. And I wanted to talk about the pandemic, and you'll hopefully see from my title slide that what I wanted to talk about was the neurodegenerative pandemic, and some of the work we've been doing that is suggesting, at the very least, suggesting that air pollution particles, specific types of air pollution particles, may be directly involved in the evolution of this neurodegenerative pandemic. The information I'm going to talk about, obviously, there's a team of us working in this area, and I've made a list of some of the key names of the people involved in developing the work and the ideas. Okay, so the pandemic, well, everyone knows what a pandemic is now. I want to draw your attention to this neurodegenerative pandemic, and in particular, three sets of conditions: Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and motor neuron disease. And the thing about these diseases is that whilst they have different sets of symptoms and different characteristics, they also share some characteristics. And I've listed some of them here. And the most critical thing really is that we're losing neurons, we're losing brain cells. And the major process of loss of neurons is through this process of excess oxidative stress. One of the key features that we see involved in each of these conditions is misfolding of proteins. We see lots of inflammation, cell signaling is altered, and overall, once the amount of damage amassed has become substantial, then you start to see clinical symptoms of loss of cognitive and motor functions. A couple of key notes about all of this is that before you actually see any of those clinical systems being manifest, it is the case that there's been major and irreparable loss of brain cells before those symptoms actually appear. And there's a second really key point that's coming out of our work, which is that we associate these diseases with the elderly on the in the majority of cases. However, it's becoming really clear that the onset of these diseases is developing really from earliest times, from childhood onwards. Now, this pandemic is growing. So, for example, in Alzheimer's disease in 2016, there were about 44 million known cases. Those are diagnosed cases. In terms of the age standardized incidence, that's an increase. So in 1990, there were about 700 cases per 100,000 people. In 2016, that had risen to 712. Parkinson's disease is showing a very rapid increase. So between 1976 and 1985, there was something like 39 cases of Parkinson's per 100,000 person years. Between 1996 and 2005, that had gone up to 56 cases. So this is growing across the world. Now, if we look at epidemiology, of course, we have lots of people examining the statistical links between environmental factors and the development and incidence of disease. And I'd just like to draw your attention to a couple of these fairly recent studies. So in 2017, there was an article published by the Canadian group in the Lancet, and the title is as presented on the screen. So they were examining the incidence of a range of neurodegenerative diseases in relation to residents within proximity of major roads. And this was a large population study based in Ontario. Looking at all of the data, so this is literally tens of millions of people, you were able to see that there was something like a 7 to 11% enhanced incidence of dementia cases in patients who lived within 50 meters of major roads. So there was a large population study taking careful account of conflicting and confounding factors that found a significantly large relationship between living close to major roads and incidence of dementia. More recently, just in October this year, again, a North American study, and this is a study that's been able to use all of the Medicaid data available in the USA. And again, this statistical analysis, you can see now, instead of just thinking about proximity to major roads, this is actually looking at exposure to air pollution, and specifically to the particulate matter that's carried in air pollution. So the top left diagram shows particulate matter concentrations, that's micrograms of particulate matter in a cubic meter of air. And the 2.5 refers to the size of those particles, so 2.5 micrometers. So the top diagram shows the distribution of PM2.5, and the middle diagram shows the incidence of Parkinson's disease, and the lowest diagram shows the incidence of Alzheimer's disease. And again, on the right-hand side, you can see the dose response curves between PM2.5 on the x-axis and the increased hazard ratio, the increased risk of developing these diseases according to the amount of exposure. So Parkinson's disease on the left-hand side of the diagram, Alzheimer's disease on the right-hand side of the diagram. Can everybody still hear me? I can hear emails pinging in. I'm just checking that it's still okay.
Yep, everything's fine.
That's great. Thanks very much. Difficult talking into the abyss, isn't it? Okay, let's move swiftly on. So airborne particulate matter. And this is a photograph of some of the refreshments I'm sure some of us have been indulging in over the holiday. But the concept is that air pollution is a real mix. It's a real cocktail of all sorts of different components. So if you think about the hazard represented by particulate matter, we've a whole range of different ingredients to that mix to be thinking about, to be worrying about what might specifically be involved with neurodegenerative disease. So airborne particulate matter, it says here, it's a cocktail of organic, that's carbon-bearing aerosols, and inorganic components. So if we look at urban particulate matter, one of the really obvious things about urban particulate matter is it's highly enriched in metals. And I've listed them for you here. So things like iron and copper and lead and zinc, etc. And also the presence of iron. Iron is a very major component of airborne particulate matter. And much of that iron is magnetically distinctive. It's magnetically ordered. We can measure its magnetic properties. So where is all this particulate matter, and particularly the metal-rich PM, where is that coming from? It's a very diverse range of sources, but anywhere where there's combustion, where there's abrasion of particles, where there's rusting and corrosion. So one of the key things we're going to see is vehicle brake wear is a really significant source of metal-rich PM. Vehicle exhaust, tyre wear, road dust, but of course there are lots of other sources, industrial sources, indoor sources. Our data suggests that something like 10% of the solid, i.e. the non-gaseous particulate matter, is composed of iron-rich and strongly magnetic nanoparticles. Nanoparticles less than 100 nanometers in diameter in those airborne particulates. This diagram is just to show you how strong is the correlation between the magnetic concentration of particles in air pollution and other sort of more conventional measurements of particulate matter. So in each case of these diagrams, the y-axis is how much magnetic material is present in the air pollution particles. And so the top left, we're measuring the magnetic content on an air filter through which we've pumped a volume of air to collect the particles against the conventional measurement of the mass of particles in a cubic meter of air. And again, you can see, a very strong direct relationship. Top right, again, the y-axis shows the magnetic content of an air filter against the measured NOx, the nitrogen oxides present at those sampling sites. And you can see from the key, this is actually work that was carried out in Rome in Italy. And the bottom diagram shows the content, magnetic content again on the y-axis, of roadside leaves against, again, the conventional air filter measurement of the mass, the micrograms of particles in a cubic meter of air. And you can see that if you're next to the roadside, much more magnetic material comes out of at the roadside compared to in this lower slope here, which is air pollution associated with an electricity generating plant. Now, very quickly, if you're wondering why leaves might be magnetic, this is a nice picture that demonstrates the wavy surface of a birch leaf in Norwich, in fact, and you can see it's just covered with particulate matter that's been deposited onto it at the roadside in this particular location. So, I want to talk to you particularly about iron-rich air pollution particles, and very often when we see these strongly magnetic, these magnetite-rich, they're nanospheres. I'll show you the pictures in a moment. These magnetic nanospheres, they're actually pervasive and abundant in urban airborne pollution. So here are some pictures of what these strongly magnetic pollution particles look like. So they're spherical because they were produced at high temperatures. They're essentially molten droplets, which after their release into the atmosphere, they cool, they crystallize, and they keep that spherical shape. And so the top left-hand particles come from the aforementioned electricity generating plant. This one is a larger particle with again, smaller spherical particles also associated with it, again, near this electricity generating plant. All of these particles, you can see the scale bar, these are nano-sized. These are collected at Lancaster roadsides. Bottom left, these were collected coming out of a vehicle exhaust pipe. And these top ones were collected at the roadside in Birmingham. So you can see that they're very distinctive, they're abundant, they're pervasive in the urban environment. This demonstrates to you, this is from Tomasz Gonet's work, so this demonstrates to you how magnetic different types of particulate matter from different sources, how magnetic those particles are. Just note that the y-axis is on a log scale. And so this is a very nice demonstration that all sorts of sources, the particles are different, the amount of iron, the amount of magnetic iron in these samples varies, but your eye is caught by how strongly magnetic vehicle brake wear actually is. It's much more magnetic even than exhaust derived particulates. Indoor particulate matter is worthy of note. Indoor particulate matter in this case coming from living rooms of domestic houses with open fires. Okay, so what is the significance of iron-rich pollution particles? So there's a couple of really important points. One is that, I think I've already mentioned, iron-bearing particles are often the most abundant metal in the solid urban particulate mix. And here's the thing, in human tissues, iron is an essential element. And that's especially so for the brain. But the brain works really, really hard to safely store and transport and regulate iron in the brain. And the reason for that is because free iron is toxic. So why should iron be toxic? It's involved in something called the Fenton reaction. So iron, you can see in this reaction here, iron reacts with hydrogen peroxide, which is a biological byproduct, and it produces, as a result of that reaction, it produces these very damaging reactive oxygen species. So in particular, the one in red there, HO, that's the hydroxyl ion, and that's one of these species that causes oxidative stress, cell damage, and if that process of production of hydroxyl ions continues at an excess rate that the body can cope with, eventually there'll be cell death. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the iron-rich composition, but it's not just the composition, it's the size of the particles that matters. So this is one of the old-fashioned diagrams, you can see it's quite old now, that demonstrates the different sizes of particle that were thought to be able to access different areas of the respiratory system. So originally much of this PM work was concerned with damage to the respiratory system. So you can see here, if you have particles less than 10 micrometers, they can actually be inhaled down into the trachea. If you have particles less than 2.5 micrometers, they can be inhaled down into the lungs. If you have particles less than a micrometer, they can get into the alveoli of the lungs and then have the potential to escape into the bloodstream. So you know, these sorts of diagrams have been floating around for, you know, the last 10 or 20 years. It was the mass of particles that of a certain size, PM10, PM2.5, that were originally regulated by policy in efforts to begin to reduce PM concentrations that we're exposed to. And again, here's one of those diagrams to try to conceptualize how big are particles that are PM10 and how big are particles that are PM2.5. So you can see here this comparison of those particles with a human hair or with, you know, particles of fine beach sand. But of course, all of this work and all of these diagrams, there is nothing appearing about the nanoparticles, things that are less than 0.1 micrometers in size, 0.1 micrometers or 100 nanometers. So here's a diagram that tries to show this. So PM10, you can see the large particle of PM10 at the far right of the diagram here. Everything to the left of the red blood cell, the red blood cell is about 7 micrometers in size. Everything to the left of that would count as PM2.5. And then we get down to, coincidentally enough, about the size of a coronavirus. And now you can see we're into the nanoparticles, or the conventional air pollution scientists often talk about ultrafine particles. Essentially, we're talking about the same thing, at least in this talk. And those are the particles that until very recently haven't received much attention in terms of air pollution monitoring or regulation. Now, here's the thing. So the policy that where people measure and try to reduce and regulate particulate matter, all policies at the moment are based on the particle mass, that how many micrograms of particles measured in a cubic meter of air. So on this diagram, you can see the particle size is plotted on the x-axis, and I've marked 100 nanometers. Everything to the right of 100 nanometers, the bigger a particle gets, of course, the heavier it weighs. So particle mass, when we measure the particle mass in a cubic meter of air, you can see the particles that dominantly contribute to the mass, the measured mass, are bigger than a micrometer. However, if we think about the number of particles, you can see that the number of particles goes up exponentially below 100 nanometers. So when we're talking about exposure to PM, the mass that is monitored and regulated is dominated by the larger particles.
Alejandro.
Hello?
How are you?
And the number is dominated by the particles less than 100 nanometers in size. Okay. If we look at the roadside, we find that most air pollution particles are nano in size. Okay, so again, this is a diagram that Thomas has pulled together. So looking at brake wear, tyre wear, exhausts, you can see that the predominant component in terms of particle size released by these vehicle sources, it's nanoparticle in size, less than 100 nanometers in size. Okay, so fairly recently, 2016, we published a paper where we demonstrated for the first time the presence in human brains of abundant nanoparticulate particles of magnetite. And the thing about those magnetite particles in the human brain, they look exactly the same. I'll show you some pictures so you can judge for yourself. They look exactly the same as those magnetite nanospheres, which are so abundant in airborne particulate pollution. And that was an important thing, because until then, it was thought that all brain magnetite was forming inside the brain. It was to do with formation of iron oxides inside the brain. So the demonstration that there were externally derived high temperature magnetite particles inside the brain was actually an important finding. I've mentioned already magnetite, free iron, magnetite, they're both toxic to brain cells, and so the presence of those magnetite nanoparticles in the brain suggests that exposure to those magnetite pollution nanoparticles might be a risk factor for neurodegenerative diseases. So here are some horrible slides. So this is electron microscopy of human brain tissues. And on the left-hand side, you can see here are some typical cells in the human brain and some mitochondria and some membranes. But you can see those opaque nanospheres of metal-rich particles. And on the right-hand side, this is a blood vessel, a micro blood vessel around the margin of one of these brain tissues. And again, you can see those very distinctive, opaque, that they look black because they're atomically dense, they're metal-rich, and you can see that they've managed to get right inside these key subcellular structures. And again, on the left-hand side, this is another example, and there's another of these iron-rich, they actually are in this case magnetite nanoparticles sitting inside the brain, and you can see the particle size is somewhere about 30 nanometers. Very briefly on the right-hand side, that there is some magnetite in the brain that's of biogenic or internal origin, and you can see how different it is. It's formed this very classic octagonal or geometric crystal shape. So that actually did form in situ. So we do find two types of magnetite in the human brain, the externally sourced and the internally sourced. The internally sourced, in comparison, for every one internal sourced brain magnetite, we found about 100 of the externally sourced. Okay, so here's just another picture just demonstrating how abundant these particles are in the brain. And again, how do we know it's magnetite? We use these spectroscopic techniques which can identify the form of the iron oxide in these particles. Most of them are magnetite, some maghemite, a little bit of hematite, but a lot of magnetite in there. And again, just to identify the composition of these particles, again on the left-hand side, this is a mitochondrion in the brain stem, and now we've switched to a slightly different sort of microscopy. So now the heavy particles, the dense particles, are now shining bright white. You can see that they're breaking through the membrane of the mitochondrion, and the little diagrams here, you can see we're mapping the chemical composition of those particles. And so you can see that most of them are iron-rich. There's a little bit of aluminium in some of them, and there are some elongate little crystals, and they are titanium-rich. So things like titanium, aluminium, they have no physiological function. They shouldn't be in the brain. Iron is in the brain naturally, but we're talking about iron which is associated with other externally sourced metals here. And again, some of the particles you can see on the bottom diagram, you can see the red square showing the particle there. And in this case, this particle is also rich in nickel and cobalt as well as iron. So a whole bunch of exotic metals that shouldn't be in the brain. So, as you know, following on from that initial paper in 2016, we've obviously been trying to build on that work in the total absence of any significant funding, I should point out. And we found that these iron and metal-rich pollution nanoparticles, in fact, they can evade all our bodily defences. So we found them in the brain, we found them in the heart, we found them in the placenta, and there's a whole bunch of other groups now beginning to work in this area, and other people are identifying them in the lungs, in the bloodstream. So this was our stuff. These particles were first identified in the frontal cortex of the brain. We've recently published a paper showing them associated with the brain stem. So that's the bit of the brain between the top of the spinal cord and the back of the brain. That area of the brain particularly badly affected by Parkinson's disease, which is why you get these motor deficits in Parkinson's. These particles were separated from lung effusions. These are particles inside mitochondria in the human heart. These are titanium-rich particles that were in the gut nervous system. And these are particles that we separated from human placental cells. So these particles can gain access to every bit of the human body. In the case of the brain, the forebrain, the frontal cortex, it's highly likely they can gain access directly through your olfactory bulb. Other ways that the particles are gaining access is if you eat them or swallow them. The nanoparticles can pass through the gut wall into the nerve system that runs between the gut and the brain stem. Okay, so I pointed out how important iron is, and again, these data are just designed to show you that just as iron is the most abundant, often the most abundant metal species in airborne air pollution, it's the most commonly found species in these particles that have been identified and analysed in human tissues. And just to sort of give you a flavour that these particles, the abundance of these particles in human tissues, we've magnetically extracted the particles from human brain samples. On the left-hand side, diagram A, we're talking about something like 10 to the 9, 10 to the 10 particles per gram of tissue. So, these particles are amazingly profuse in these human samples. So at this point, I show you some diagrams and some images rather, and I say, so please tell me which of these magnetite nanospheres came out of a brain and which were sampled at the roadside. And it's very difficult, isn't it, electronically to have this discussion, but anyway, I hope you're sitting there thinking, well, they all look pretty much the same. So that's what I was saying about how similar are the particles we see in the tissues and the particles we sample at the roadside. Okay, you've seen this slide before. I said, what was the significance of the iron-rich composition of these air pollution particles? Critically, of all the particles we see in human tissues, iron seems to be the most abundant. And again, the significance of that is we know that iron, if it's uncontrolled in the brain, causes excess formation of these damaging rectodioxin species. Okay, just to sort of bring all this to some sort of conclusion. So here's an image of what an Alzheimer's brain looks like, and you can see the loss of functioning neurons. You see the appearance of these senile plaques and tangles. And it is the case that AD brains in localized regions contain more iron than normal brains. Both plaques and tangles are known to be sites where metal concentrations are higher than in normal brain tissue. So the people who've been working on AD for the last few decades, they have become increasingly concerned about mishandling of iron, that iron appears to be directly connected to Alzheimer's pathology. And in fact, when people look at the AD plaques, magnetite nanoparticles are directly associated with those plaques. So the yellow arrows on the left-hand side, this is through an AD plaque from a human sample, and the yellow arrows are pointing to those metal-rich, bright nanospheres. And again, you can see those on the right-hand side here. They only consist of iron and oxygen. They actually are magnetite nanoparticles sitting right in the middle of an AD plaque. So this is a slide from David Alsop. The thinking is that the Fenton reaction, the reaction between iron and hydrogen peroxide, is intimately connected with the misfolding of the proteins, the formation of those plaques that are the pathological marker of Alzheimer's disease. And that's what we've seen in our examination of highly exposed young subjects. So we've been looking at, when I say young subjects, even as young as 11 months in age, of our highly exposed cases from Mexico City. So when we see these iron, aluminium and titanium rich nanoparticles, they're sitting inside subcellular structures, and those structures show evidence of damage. So the left-hand diagram, the black patches are patches of something called neuromelanin, which is trying to soak up these excess metal ions. The right-hand side, you can see these mitochondria. These are the energy-producing structures in our cells. And again, there are particles sitting inside them. Their membranes are damaged. Their cristae are damaged. So we see at every microscopic level that where these particles are, the cells and their structures are showing damage. So these are histochemical sections that I'm showing you. And again, you can see tangles, plaques, neurites, and the majority of these particular images come from people who aren't as old as 32 years in age. Okay, so to wrap it all up, it seems plausible, absolutely plausible at this stage, that iron-rich pollution nanoparticles represent a potentially pervasive risk factor. And that's because of their size. They can get access to all of these critical structures. They are specifically toxic to the brain, and they're abundant within airborne particulate matter. So because of all of those factors, it seems, as I say, entirely plausible that they might be an environmental risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. If that's the case, we can also predict, of course, that where you have higher concentrations of magnetite pollution nanoparticles in certain occupations, or if you're exposed outdoors from vehicle sources or from industrial sources, or if you're exposed indoors, for example, from open fires, you'd expect your exposure to these magnetite pollution nanoparticles will be greater. Right, looking ahead, it's all very miserable stuff, isn't it? But looking ahead, I've always said, if you know your enemy, you can do something about him. And so in terms of future strategies, it seems imperative to me that must be more targeted analysis of these particles, monitoring in order to move to regulation, i.e. regulation in order to reduce the numbers of these air pollution nanoparticles that we're being exposed to. On an individual level, once you know that there is this component in air pollution that might be killing your brain, then anything you can do to reduce your own dose is obviously going to be a very sensible idea. And that's particularly sensible if you have young children whose brains are still developing, and or if you're pregnant. And between us all, there's no doubt we should be pressing for government policy change at every level. And if vehicle brake-wear, for example, is a really substantial source of these iron-rich and strongly magnetic nanoparticles, then even faster introduction of the e-vehicle fleet is likely to be a good thing. Okay, so thank you very much for your time and attention on this chilly morning, and it sounds all very miserable, but anyway, I do send everybody my very best wishes for a happy and healthy new year, and make sure you reduce your particulate dose as much and as soon as you can. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Barbara. Thanks for a fascinating, slightly concerning presentation, but fascinating opportunities for new science here. An awful lot we don't know about these issues. We've got time for some brief questions. If anyone would like to raise a hand, I think that Rachel got in there first with a question in the chat. So Rachel, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Barbara. That was a really good talk, and I'm absolutely terrified because I have no other source of heat apart from a wood burner, and it's super smoky. So I feel like I'm killing my brain as I'm sat here. As it's not just about exhaust fumes in towns and like braking as well, how will electric cars kind of overcome this issue? And do we actually need to be more radical and say like we need people to live separate from where we're transporting things?
So it's true enough that e-vehicles will still be producing brake wear and tyre wear and road dust. But one of the interesting things about braking for e-vehicles is mostly they use regenerative braking. So they're using much less of the sort of conventional frictional braking. And so actually, I think in terms of brake wear, obviously no exhaust particulates, but also probably a very large reduction in brake wear derived particulates as well. We do still then have problems of tyre wear and road dust. So yeah, in an ideal world, you know, you would be looking to planners, to policymakers to try to separate people living away from major roadways. However, anytime you're traveling on a major roadway inside a vehicle, you're still getting exposed to those particulates. So, you know, we really do have to think very carefully about this. But as a first step, at least, electrification of the fleet is going to make a big difference.
Question from Nigel there.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Fascinating and frightening, but for me, really interesting because I'm interested in the long-term human history of metallurgy and mining, and this long process of turning the earth inside out that we're doing at an accelerating rate. So what's interesting me at the moment is climate change, earth system change is impacting now on the kind of what's been left behind from centuries, if not thousands of years of bringing shit to the surface. More wildfire, enhanced hydrological cycle. I think of this in terms of the fan hitting the shit, right? Is this also going to be bringing settled particulate matter increasingly into circulation if we're thinking about climate change and system change?
Absolutely. So biomass burning, there's no doubt, you know, that's becoming very important. I mean, I've talked today mostly about brain health, or in fact, mostly about brain disease, unfortunately. But anyway, but we've done some other work on cardiovascular impacts of these particles. So it's well known that major forest fires are associated with cardiovascular damage. It's well established. There's another side of this as well, Nigel, which is that we keep on making more and more of these nanoparticles and releasing them into the environment for people to be exposed to. So, you know, some of those nanoparticles in the brainstem were titanium rich, and the industry of producing titanium bearing nanoparticles is developing absolutely exponentially all across the globe. So we've got titanium dioxide nanoparticles in toothpaste, in paints, in electrical filaments, in all sorts of materials, consumer materials. We've got 3D printing processes metallic lathes that are producing magnetite nanoparticles. Vehicle brake-wear. I didn't know at the time of the 2016 paper. We were contacted. I was contacted after that paper came out by people who work in the automotive industry, and they said, "Oh, did you know that brake pad formulations often have up to 30% by volume magnetite powders added to them for frictional and lubrication purposes?" And you think, so we are actively increasing the nanoparticle loadings that we're all being exposed to. So we dropped lead out of petrol, we dropped asbestos out of brakes, but we appear to be, rapidly and efficiently replacing them with other hazards.
Wow. I think we need to talk, because my interest in turning the earth inside out in metallurgy and your interest, there's a lot of convergence. So this is frightening, but very, very interesting for me. Thanks so much, Barbara.
Sounds good to me, Nigel. Mine's a double gin and tonic.
Excellent.
Just squeeze in one last question. We had a question from Mandy Dillon. Do you want to ask it directly, Mandy?
Probably a naive question, really. I wondered, knowing that they're magnetic, is there any way to safely remove them, Barbara, once they're in these organs, or is it too late once they're there?
I think it's too late once they're there, to be honest. I mean, it is a very interesting area. So there's a big Parkinson's study going on in London at the moment, and it's quite a long time now. People have been thinking of treating Parkinson's by reducing the iron content through administering chelating drugs. So chelating drugs will solubilize the iron and allow the cerebrospinal fluid to clear it from the brain, is the theory. And people have tried these iron chelating drugs in the past without very much success. But there actually is a big study going on in London where they've actually upped the dose and continued it for longer, and they claim now to be seeing some improvement. I'm a bit skeptical because, to be honest, when you're actually already treating people with manifest symptoms, the amount of neuron loss has been enormous and probably irreparable. So the whole thing points to reducing the exposure in the first place. And I mentioned, these young cases in Mexico City. So again, if these cases we look at are all post-mortem, right? So these are young people who've been killed. They've had a sudden death, whether it's been a road traffic accident or a violent death, or and that's why there's been a pathological examination and tissue samples taken. So those people are all post-mortem. But if you look at those post-mortem cases and you find all this evidence of already neurological damage in young people in Mexico City, then your prediction would be that living young people in Mexico City should be showing some cognitive impairments. And that's the really grim side of this story, is that work going on at the moment in Mexico City shows very large numbers of young people, and this is a cohort that's had at minimum 9 years of secondary education, like more than 30% are showing significant cognitive impairment, and a significant number are showing these motor deficits. So there's a test where you're sitting down and you stand up and walk away, and if your balance is at all dysfunctional, you take a much longer time to be able to achieve that. And these young people in Mexico City, that's the sorts of symptoms they're demonstrating. So that's how we know, both from the pathology and the current investigation of living young people in Mexico City, that these things in highly exposed populations are kicking off really very early in life.
Gosh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Barbara. I know we have a number of other questions coming in, but I think we better move on. So thanks very much indeed, Barbara.